France has experienced several weeks of social unrest since massive protests erupted across the country on November 17th in response to tax increases on gas and diesel, which were slated to take effect at the beginning of the new year. The Institute for Energy Research's policy director, Kenny Stein, happened to be in France at the onset of these protests. We sat down to discuss the issue, along with our colleague, Jordan McGillis.
You're listening to the Plugged In Podcast, a new project from the Institute for Energy Research. To find out more about our work, visit our website at instituteforenergyresearch.org.
Welcome to the Plugged In Podcast. I'm Alex Stevens. I'm joined today by my colleagues Jordan McGillis and Kenny Stein, and we're here to talk today about the protests in France over their recent carbon tax. Guys, thanks for joining me today.
Bonjour.
Kenny, you were recently in Europe for a trip, and from my understanding, you actually encountered the beginning of these protests while you were there.
Les Gilets jaunes.
Yeah, right. It just was very random. We just happened to be, we were driving actually around in northern France, and so on the first day of the protests, which was November 17th, I believe, we drove through a roundabout that was by the place we were staying, and we saw one of the entry roads into the roundabout was blocked by a truck and some people with yellow vests on. And I sort of looked at them and I was like, oh, that's probably some sort of labor protest, probably some truckers or something protesting, who knows what, because we know the French love to protest.
They love to strike. It's the national sport.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's a strike every weekend type thing. So then the next day, the Sunday, we went off, and as we were coming back to our place, our GPS kept showing all these delays, like 10 and 20 minute delays everywhere, and it kept trying to send us on these squirrely little routes all on these back roads, and I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. And I ignored the GPS and just went back to the same roundabout that we went through, because that was the easiest way to get to our place. This time, Sunday, completely blocked. There were probably 50 people there. There were bonfires built up, and there were gates across all the roundabouts, and they were basically slowing down traffic. And they were letting people through slowly, but you basically had to stop, and they'd move the gate out, and then you could go. And
what was the demeanor like of the Provocateurs?
Yeah, it was I describe it to when people ask, it was like a neighborhood block party. It was like everyone, all these local folks just sort of came to hang out in the roundabout, and they built little fires, and lots of people had beers cracked, and they were just hanging out, having a good time. And there were some police hanging out there too, sort of supervising, just looking on. But it was very, very calm, very happy. The vest protesters were coming up to people's cars, and people rolling down the windows, chatting about it. It was frankly, it was a festive atmosphere.
I don't think we can make a one-to-one comparison of the regions of France versus the regions of the United States, but that area of northern France where you encountered this is probably somewhat akin to the U.S. Rust Belt, right? It was once a heavily industrialized area that is slightly removed from the power center in Paris, and might see a power disparity between the capital and that region.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It was Normandy, which it was right outside the town of Caen, which I think that probably generally describes it. Yeah, France is
perhaps not as industrialized on that side as the northeastern side of the country.
France's industrial areas are scattered a bit around the country, but I think it's certainly what I think we've seen since then, the last couple of weeks, is that it's about people away from the capital, away from Paris. People who, in Caen, there's no public transport. Well, there's buses, but there's no metro. There's long distance trains, but there aren't to the suburbs of town. There's no trains, so people have to drive. And I mean, outside Paris and the other big cities, everyone has to drive. They rely on their cars, which is why this protest initially was about fuel taxes. I mean, that's really what sparked it. France already, it's noticeable. Just we also filled up for gas in Spain and other countries, and it was noticeable how much cheaper just crossing the border. Suddenly, the gas price plunged, and it's because France taxes the hell out of their gasoline.
What were the actual specifics of the new tax that they had levied, or what actually brought all this?
Right. Well, and this was it was literally a straw that broke the camel's back type thing. There was some the next tax rise. There had already been tax rises for 2018 for this year, and then there was another tax rise that was supposed to start January 1st, 2019, and it was about 30 cents, the equivalent about 30 cents per gallon for diesel and about 10 cents per gallon for gasoline. And that difference was intentional because it was intentionally to be more punitive on diesel gasoline.
Our fuel taxes, our gas tax here in the U.S., certainly not a good thing, but it's oriented at least nominally toward infrastructure. But this tax increase was explicitly about emissions reductions. Is that correct?
Right. Well, the French taxes, they go into the general fund. There's no, like in the U.S., technically our gas taxes are routed into the Highways Trust Fund, and they're supposed to be spent on, obviously that gets gamed a little bit, but they're supposed to be spent on roads and mass transit and stuff like that. But in France, it all goes into the general pot, and it's just a tax. And President Macron specifically pitched these tax increases as reducing fuel in order to meet their Paris climate commitment. So it's a carbon tax. It's trying to reduce consumption and emission of CO2 from cars.
I think the day after all this started happen, I came in here and I was talking to Jordan, and obviously we were interested in the story, but it gets into something that proponents of carbon taxes don't really tend to address, is that at the end of the day, if you impose a carbon tax, the average person just sees rising prices, and your ability to deal with that politically is a problem for policymakers, and it's not something that they ever really address. So,
right.
Well, I would challenge that they don't address it. I think that they realize there's that problem. The French blew it. American proponents of carbon taxes are now discussing what they call the fee and dividend, because they see that the price increase is going to be very unpopular. So they're trying to reframe this as something that's going to benefit people who are on the poorer end of the spectrum.
Right. That's the game.
And so these protests in France have actually raised the profile of the fee and dividend style of carbon tax here in the U.S. And that's what we see from groups like the Climate Leadership Council at the national level and at the local level. I know here in D.C. there's a group called Put a Price on It D.C., and they intend to lure support from working class people with a massive, essentially, redistribution. So from the perspective of these folks here in the U.S., the French just went about that wrong and should have seen that as an obvious problem.
Well, the one thing, though, is it depends on how you design it, because what you saw in France, it wasn't the poor that was out there protesting. These were middle class folks that, they're all employed. Some of them were working class. Some of them, the truckers obviously are affected by the fuel taxes, so the truckers were very involved. But these were regular people that they just have to drive to work, or they have to commute into town, or they have to drive to go shopping because they don't live. The local stores have closed, and they have to drive to a Carrefour or something. So some of these rebate programs are designed to rebate money just to the poor. That's sort of the Washington State carbon tax that failed. But the problem is that everyone feels this, and middle class folks feel it too. They notice the higher prices. So unless some of the proposals are give everyone a check, but
Right.
But that's not the common ones. That's not the one that's been voted on.
I think it's
in Washington.
Important to emphasize that even the so-called rebate that would go equally to all households is still a redistribution, because the people who are spending more are not being rebated for what they spent. They're just being rebated the same as everyone else, and
Right.
spending tends to correlate with wealth or with income.
But I think you still run into the political problem, though, because there's the period between when you initiate the tax and when people will receive this rebate, right? So there's going to be some period of time where people are just going to see rising energy prices, and you can communicate to them, well, you're going to receive a rebate, but not everybody is plugged into every single policy thing out there, and trying to get an entire country to understand the intricacies of a carbon tax.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's just not it's not practical.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure it's that intricate. If you tell people they're going to get a monthly check, they don't need to know where that money's coming
Is
from.
it supposed to be a monthly check?
That's
I was
how
thinking
most
it
of
was
them would
supposed
be.
to be a yearly check.
No, most of them are monthly.
Okay.
So it's not like you'd be waiting till the next fiscal year on your or until your tax returns are filed. It would be monthly with most of the plans. So it really does worry me as an opponent of the carbon tax, because I think a lot of people will find that style appealing. But as our recent study shows, the study produced by Capital Alpha Partners, the fee and dividend or rebate approach is actually the least economically efficient of any carbon tax. So they're all bad. This one is particularly bad because of the way that it utilizes that revenue.
Yeah. I don't necessarily agree with you that people are going to make that connection. I'm sort of with Alex.
Okay.
I think that people are going to see rising prices, and yeah, you're going to be like, oh yeah, but you're getting a check in exchange. But just most people don't have the math skills to try and figure out whether they're coming out ahead or behind. They're just noticing that everything's more expensive, and maybe I get whatever $50 or $100 a month, but if they see higher prices every single day, and then at some point in the future they get a little bit of money, I think psychologically
that's a good point. And I would also bring up something we've talked about, Alex, is that simply doing the math of somebody spends this much on energy and they're going to get this so-called dividend which exceeds that doesn't really mean they're going to be better off, because their choices are completely changed by the carbon tax. That's really important to emphasize
right.
as well.
There's a deadweight loss to that. Yeah.
It's important for people to feel like they have. Well, it's important for people to know that they have access to energy, fuel especially, because people who don't live in areas that have access to
electric scooters.
Yeah, electric scooters and the metro or things like that. They rely on having to drive places, and we can have conversations about the way that we fund roads and stuff, and that's an important part of that discussion. But at the end of the day, the world that we live in right now, people rely on cars to get them to work, to get them to do the things that they're interested in doing in their lives. So when you threaten that with a tax or other policies, the reaction to it is going to be similar to what we're seeing in France.
Well, I think that's actually a really good point, Alex, and I think this connects back to France between the rural and the urban. It's the same way in the U.S. Like in the U.S., if you're in a city, there are some options to reduce your energy consumption. You can make adjustments, but if you're living in the suburbs or in a rural area, you don't have a choice to drive less. You have to drive. Or if you live in out in the middle of nowhere in a cold weather climate, it costs more to heat your house than if you're in a multi-unit apartment building where everyone's heat sort of heats everyone else. So yeah, people that live outside cities tend to have higher energy needs, and they don't have the alternative. So they're going to face higher prices, and then it ends up being a bit of a wealth transfer from the suburbs and rural areas to people in the cities.
I think something people would say, though, to push back on us would be that, people should be moving to cities, which,
right. Well,
is...
That's the social engineering aspect of it, yeah. And they shouldn't be driving cars, and they should be moving in more dense housing and all that kind of thing. But I'd say that in a free country, I'd prefer that people have that choice.
Something that's on my mind here, it's not fully formulated, we'll see where this goes, is the cultural similarities and differences between France and the United States that surround these sort of issues of the so-called elites and the so-called common people. They're not exactly the same in the dynamics.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., at least now, here in 2018, the people who are embodying that kind of common man perspective seem to be supporters of Donald Trump and tend to be further to the right generally, and tend to be anti-tax across the board, anti-welfare state. But in France and the other European countries, the people who are opposed to these taxes, they're often combining that with their opposition to what they see as a weakening of the welfare state. I saw that in Belgium and the Netherlands, where these protests have spread to. They've kind of brought several different issues to the fore. And so it's not exactly like what we see here politically.
It's happened with the French protesters as well. They've added to their demands. They want an increase in the minimum wage.
Right, and that was Macron agreed to something along those lines.
He gave some concessions to try and address that. But yeah, that I mean,
so it's not a free market movement. It's an they see it as an anti-elite movement.
Right. Oh no, I think that's an important distinction. But in France, it's a protest against the wealthy elites like Macron living in Paris who are lording it over the rest of the country. And there's a little bit of that in the U.S., but it's a little different dynamics. But I'd actually say that's why this has broken out into a protest first in France, is because they have a cultural protest, a historic cultural protest, but they're in a more dire situation, and so the carbon taxes and France is furthest along in the carbon tax effort too. So they're feeling the pain, but this is the sort of pain that everyone will feel if you continue to impose these policies, and eventually it reaches a breaking point. Now it'll be a different kind of breaking point in every country, but
this may be beyond any of the three of ours knowledge, but is there any sort of border adjustment within the European common market on these sorts of things, or is France just basically forcing businesses to move to nearby countries that have lower taxes and fewer restrictions on these things?
Well, for gas taxes, there isn't, and people that live close enough will pop across the border to get cheaper gas. Like that absolutely happens. As far as the industrial stuff, the EU has wider climate change mandates, so I'm not sure how much of that really happens, but I wouldn't be surprised if, places like France and Germany or the Netherlands already have higher costs, like in labor costs and employment costs. So adding on higher energy costs, I think that does make a difference in moving. But I'm not sure how much emissions arbitrage there is within the EU, just because they have a pretty unified regulatory process on that.
Right, and if there were, it still may not affect France much as a pretty large geographic country. People aren't going to be leaving the center of France to go get gas in a nearby country, certainly. But some of the smaller countries in the Benelux area, they may actually do that regularly. I don't know.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Andorra does is they don't have taxes on fuel. So their gas is dirt cheap.
But you got to drive up those mountains to get there.
People do sneak across the border to get gas that live close enough. That's definitely true. But the other thing I just to point out is, like what we were saying, is that the protests have expanded into, there's a lot of grievances now that are all wrapped up in it. It's an anti-elite movement now, but still every day, and that's what, like, the protests in Paris have become an anti-elite rioting protest, but still the greater part of these protests is blocking roads and taking over toll booths, like basically denying revenue to the state as a retaliation for these tax rises. Because in addition to having high gas taxes, which they're really high, most of the main truck roads in France have ridiculously high tolls on them. There's taxes on purchasing cars. There's taxes everywhere on the transportation system. So one of their biggest revolts has been to take over toll booths and wave people through for free. I actually took advantage of that at a couple toll booths too, where we just stopped for a couple minutes and then they waved us through and saved 5, 6, 7 euros per toll booth. And it's a retaliation against the state to deny them that revenue.
Well, it shows too that whenever there's political momentum for something, everybody's going to try and jump onto it. So, if it were going the other way and people were demanding a carbon tax, right, we'd see the same thing. We'd see a bunch of other political things jump on and try to take advantage of that political momentum, and that's something that we worry about.
The most the one thing though is that these types of persistent, passionate protests that tend to be, you're usually not asking the government to take more money from them or raise their taxes. It tends to be lower the taxes or give us money. And that's kind of a problem with the carbon tax. So I'm not sure you're going to see protests clamoring for carbon tax.
Really difficult to imagine. But that prompts another thought in my mind, which is that advocates for mitigation of our carbon emissions may shift their attention from the tax back to a more command and control regulatory approach because it's more hidden from the average person, and that's a concern in its own right.
Honestly, we're already seeing that with some of the green advocates on the left have been rubbishing a lot of the carbon tax
Right,
discussion.
and they've never really been on board with it for two reasons. The first reason is that they believe that it's regressive, and then the second reason is that they don't think it does enough to get to the level of emission reduction that they want to see. So, as we said, they would prefer to have a lot more command and control, maybe in addition to a carbon tax.
Yeah, right, exactly, and it's definitely, they prefer it to be hidden. That one, it gives them more power, and two, they hope that they can hide the cost of the actions that they're trying to take.
Right.
And down the line, if they want to make changes to it too, it's easier to...
Right, yeah, exactly.
Okay, guys, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out going forward, and thanks for coming in and talking today.
Merci, à tout à l'heure.